A quiet afternoon settled over the small town of Maplewood. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow on the tree-lined streets. Birds chirped merrily, and children played in their yards, enjoying the carefree days of summer. But in one part of town, the peaceful atmosphere was about to be shattered. Max, a 16-year-old boy, was driving his grandmother, Mrs. Davis, home from her weekly knitting circle. The old car rattled as it rolled down the road, but Max didn't mind. He loved spending time with his grandmother, and she always had the best stories to share. As they drove, she sat comfortably in the passenger seat, her hands busy with a colorful ball of yarn, knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a new scarf. "Are you excited for the family picnic next weekend, Grandma?" Max asked, glancing at her with a smile. "Oh, my dear, I can't wait," Mrs. Davis replied, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I've been making that potato salad you love so much. Just wait until you taste it." Max chuckled, imagining his grandmother bustling around the kitchen, mixing ingredients and telling him to stay out of the way. He always enjoyed her cooking, especially at family gatherings. The thought of seeing all his relatives filled him with joy. As they turned onto Maple Street, Max noticed a police car parked at the side of the road. He felt a twinge of anxiety but pushed it aside. It was a quiet day. Surely they weren't looking for trouble. Little did he know, trouble was about to find him. Without warning, the police car pulled out behind them, lights flashing bright red and blue. Max's heart raced. "Oh, Grandma, I think we're getting pulled over," he said, trying to sound calm. "Oh dear," Mrs. Davis replied, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "Just stay calm, Max. You haven't done anything wrong." Max nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he pulled over to the side of the road. He parked the car, and the police officer stepped out, walking toward them with a serious expression on his face. Max could feel his palms start to sweat. "Good afternoon," the officer said, leaning down to peer through the open window. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Max shook his head, trying to collect his thoughts. "No, sir. I don't know what I did." The officer straightened up, crossing his arms. "I clocked you going a bit over the speed limit back there. Can I see your driver's license and registration?" Max nodded and reached for his wallet. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the small leather case. He handed the officer his license, trying to ignore the nervousness bubbling up inside him. His grandmother remained calm, but he could see the concern in her eyes. As the officer examined the license, Max glanced at Mrs. Davis. She was still knitting, but now she had paused, her eyes focused on the officer with a worried expression. Max knew she didn't like the police, but he hoped this would be a quick stop. The officer had a stern face, but Max felt that if he remained polite, everything would be fine. After a moment, the officer returned his attention to Max. "Where are you headed?" "We were just coming back from my grandma's knitting circle," Max replied, trying to sound confident. "We were on our way home." "Do you mind if I ask how old you are?" The officer continued, his tone steady. "I'm 16, Max said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer raised an eyebrow. "And how long have you been driving?" "Just a few months," Max answered, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The officer paused, studying him for a moment before speaking again. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Please." Max's heart sank. "Why? Is there something wrong?" "Just step out of the car, Max," the officer repeated, his voice firm but not unkind. As Max opened the door and stepped out, he could feel his grandmother's eyes on him, filled with concern. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "I didn't mean to break any rules," he said, hoping to diffuse the tension. The officer waved his hand. "I'm not here to give you a hard time, but we need to check a few things. Just stand over there for a moment." Max nodded, walking to the side of the road as directed. He glanced back at his grandmother, who was now looking more worried than ever. "It's okay, Grandma. I'll be fine," he reassured her, but he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The officer approached the car, and Max could see him peering inside. He felt a pang of anxiety, unsure of what was going to happen next. Just then, another police car arrived, and two more officers stepped out. They exchanged words with the first officer, and Max's heart sank further. "Is something wrong?" he called out, his voice trembling. The first officer turned back to him, looking serious. "We need to ask you a few more questions. Stay where you are." Max's mind raced as he stood there, feeling like a deer caught in headlights. He watched the officers rummaging through the car, and a sense of dread settled in the pit of his stomach. What were they looking for? Suddenly, the officer in the car pulled something out from under the seat, holding it up for the others to see. Max squinted, trying to see what it was, but he couldn't make it out. He felt his breath quicken, and the world around him began to blur. "Max," Mrs. Davis called out, her voice shaking. "What is happening?" Just then, the officer turned back to Max with a look of disbelief on his face. "We're going to need to take you in for further questioning." Max's heart dropped. "What? Why? What did I do?" The officer's face was serious. "You might be in more trouble than you think. We need to figure this out now." As Max stood there, confusion and fear flooding his mind, he realized that this quiet afternoon was about to change his life forever. The stunning discovery was just around the corner, and it was not going to be what he expected. Max stood by the roadside, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt heavy with tension as the officer's words echoed in his mind. "We're going to need to take you in for further questioning." He glanced back at his grandmother, Mrs. Davis, whose face was now pale with worry. "What is going on?" she called out, her voice trembling. Max could see her knitting needles drop to her lap as she gripped the edge of her seat. "I don't know, Grandma. Just hang on," Max shouted back, trying to reassure her despite the fear creeping into his voice. The first officer approached him again, his expression serious. "Max, we found something under the passenger seat that raises some red flags." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We need to verify where you got this car and what you know about it." Max felt a wave of panic wash over him. "What do you mean?" "This is my grandma's car. It's old, but it's ours. I've been driving it for months." The officer continued to stare at him, and the tension grew thicker. "Can you prove that? We need to see the registration and insurance documents." "I gave you the registration," Max protested, feeling the frustration bubble up. "I don't understand what's happening." "Please calm down," the officer said, raising a hand as if to calm a startled animal. "We're just trying to make sure everything is in order." Max took a deep breath, struggling to steady himself. "It's fine. I can get you the documents again," he said, willing to do whatever it took to clear up this misunderstanding. "Just stay right here," the officer instructed, stepping back towards the car. Max watched as he and the other officers examined the interior, their faces grim. The situation felt surreal, like something out of a movie. As Max waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He remembered how his grandmother had always told him to be careful around police officers. "They can be unpredictable," she would say, knitting her brows. "Always be respectful, but stay alert." Max glanced back at Mrs. Davis, who looked increasingly anxious. "They'll figure it out, Grandma," he said, trying to sound convincing. "There's nothing wrong with the car." Suddenly, the officer returned with a small, crumpled bag in his hand. Max's stomach dropped as he saw it. "What's that?" he asked, pointing nervously. The officer opened the bag, revealing a collection of items, some cash, a small knife, and what looked like a plastic bag with something inside. "We found this under your seat. Do you have any explanation for it?" Max's eyes widened in shock. "No, that's not mine. I don't know how it got there." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You expect us to believe that?" "Yes, I swear," Max pleaded, feeling desperation clawing at him. "I've been driving this car for weeks. I've never seen that stuff before. The officer stepped closer, scrutinizing Max's face. Look, we're just trying to get to the bottom of this. If you didn't put it there, then who did? You must have some idea. Max racked his brain, feeling a headache coming on. I didn't take this car anywhere. We just drove it home from the knitting circle. Then you're saying someone else was in the car before you? The officer pressed. Max's heart raced as he considered the implications. Maybe it was my older cousin. He borrowed the car a couple of weeks ago. I didn't think he left anything in there. The officer nodded slowly, writing something down in his notebook. What's your cousin's name? His name is Jake, but I really don't think he would do anything illegal. He's a good guy. The officer's expression softened just a bit. We'll need to contact him. Can you give us his information? Max nodded, feeling the glimmer of hope. Yeah, of course. He lives just a few blocks away from here. Before he could say more, the officer turned away, speaking to his partners. They seemed to be considering their next move. Max watched them anxiously, hoping they would find a solution soon. As Max stood there, Mrs. Davis called out again, her voice trembling. Max, please come back here. I'm worried. I'm fine, Grandma. Just a little misunderstanding. He shouted back, but inside he felt anything but fine. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. A few minutes later, the first officer returned. We've made a decision. You're going to be taken to the station for further questioning. It's just a formality, but we need to sort this out. Max's heart sank. Does that mean I'm under arrest? For now, yes, the officer replied. We'll sort everything out, and if you're innocent, you'll be free to go. Max felt a wave of nausea wash over him. But I didn't do anything. I understand, the officer said, his tone surprisingly sympathetic. Just come with us, and we'll get to the bottom of this. As they walked toward the police car, Max couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What would happen next? He glanced back at Mrs. Davis, who looked small and fragile in the passenger seat. Don't worry, Grandma. Max called out as the officer opened the car door for him. I'll be back soon. As he got into the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this day was far from over. The discovery of that bag and its contents had turned his life upside down, and he had no idea what lay ahead. All he could do was hope that the truth would come out before it was too late. As the police car pulled away from the roadside, Max felt a mix of anxiety and confusion. He sat in the back seat, glancing at the officer in the front, who was busy typing something into a computer. The cool air inside the car did little to soothe the heat rising in his chest. Max's mind raced. He replayed the events of the day in his head. How had a simple drive with his grandmother turned into this nightmare? All he wanted was to spend time with Mrs. Davis, enjoying the day and the fresh air. Instead, they were caught up in something that felt so wrong. Just stay calm, Max whispered to himself, trying to muster some courage. He thought about his cousin Jake. He was the only person who could help explain the strange bag found in the car. Max felt certain that Jake would have an explanation. If only he could get the officers to see that he wasn't involved in whatever trouble this was. As they arrived at the police station, the officer turned to Max. You'll have to wait here for a moment while we check your cousin's information. Max nodded, feeling like a deer caught in headlights. The station was busy, with officers moving around, answering phones, and talking to people. He felt small and out of place, surrounded by the chaos of law enforcement. He waited, tapping his fingers nervously on the armrest. His thoughts drifted to his grandmother. Was she okay? He could still see her worried face, and the image gnawed at him. He wished he could comfort her, tell her everything would be fine. After what felt like an eternity, the officer returned, holding a piece of paper. We spoke to your cousin, he said. He has a solid alibi for the time you were driving. However, we still need to ask you some questions. Okay, but please, I didn't do anything wrong. Max insisted, his voice shaking slightly. I understand. "We just need to figure out how that bag ended up in your car," the officer replied, leading Max into a small interrogation room. The room was plain, with a table and 2 chairs. The walls were painted a dull gray, and a single light bulb hung overhead, casting a harsh light. Max sat down, feeling a weight settle on his shoulders. "Let's start from the beginning," the officer said, sitting across from him. "Tell me everything you remember about your drive today." Max took a deep breath. "I picked up my grandma from the knitting circle around noon. We decided to go for a drive to enjoy the weather. We just drove around the neighborhood." "Did anyone else ride with you?" "No, it was just us," Max replied, shaking his head. "I swear, I had no idea there was anything in the car." The officer nodded, making notes. "What about your cousin, Jake? Can you tell me more about when he borrowed the car?" Max's brow furrowed as he thought. "He borrowed it about 2 weeks ago. He said he needed it for a quick errand. He returned it the same day, and I didn't notice anything unusual." "Did you notice anything different about the car?" the officer pressed. "Not really," Max said slowly. "I mean, it's an old car, so it has some wear and tear, but it runs fine. I don't think he would have put anything illegal in there." The officer studied Max for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "All right, but we need to talk to Jake. We need to get to the bottom of this." Max felt a glimmer of hope. "Please, do it. He can explain everything. He wouldn't do anything like this." The officer nodded, standing up. "I'll make the call, but for now, you'll have to wait." Max sat in the room, feeling time stretch. What felt like hours passed as he stared at the table, thinking about his grandmother. He wanted to reassure her that he would be fine, but he had no way to do that. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer returned. "We've reached your cousin," he said, looking more serious than before. "Jake claims he didn't leave anything in the car. He says he just borrowed it to pick up some supplies. However, he mentioned he met someone that day." Max's heart raced. "What do you mean? Who?" The officer leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Jake mentioned that a man approached him at the store, asking about the car. He thought it was strange, but he didn't think much of it at the time." "What kind of man?" Max asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. "A man in a black SUV," the officer replied. "He didn't get a name, but it's possible that this man could be involved." Max's mind was racing. "But why would anyone put something in my grandma's car? We haven't done anything wrong." The officer sighed. "That's what we need to figure out. For now, I'm going to let you go home, but I need you to stay available for more questions. We'll need your cousin's contact information, too." Max felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you. I just want to go home to my grandma." As they left the interrogation room, Max's heart felt lighter. Maybe they were finally getting closer to the truth. But as he stepped out of the station, the nagging feeling of fear lingered in the back of his mind. What if the man in the black SUV came back? What if this wasn't over yet? He couldn't shake the thought as he headed back to the car, determined to protect his grandmother and uncover the mystery that had turned their day upside down. As Max and the officer walked out of the police station, the air felt heavy with unspoken tension. Max's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of the man in the black SUV from his mind. Who was he? What did he want with their family? The officer directed Max to wait outside while he returned to the desk to finalize the paperwork for his release. Max's gaze drifted to the parking lot, where the police cars gleamed under the afternoon sun. His heart raced as he wondered what would happen next. Would the police be able to find the man who had put them in this situation? A few moments later, the officer returned, looking more serious than ever. "All right, Max. You can go home, but I need you to keep your phone on. If we find out more information, we'll reach out to you. And remember, don't talk to anyone about this, especially not your cousin Jake." Max nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Thank you. I'll keep my phone on." He made his way to the old car, taking a deep breath before getting inside. He needed to find his grandmother and reassure her. He couldn't let her worry. She had already been through so much. As he drove home, the familiar streets felt different. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. The world seemed peaceful, but inside him, a storm was brewing. What if the man in the SUV was watching them? What if they were still in danger? When Max pulled into the driveway, he saw Mrs. Davis sitting on the porch, knitting quietly. The sight of her made his heart ache. She was so calm, but he knew she must be feeling scared too. "Max, you're home," she called out, her voice warm and inviting. "Yeah, Grandma. I'm here," he replied, forcing a smile as he stepped out of the car. As he walked up to her, he felt a mix of relief and guilt. "I'm so sorry about everything that happened today. I didn't mean for you to get caught up in this mess." Mrs. Davis looked up from her knitting, her eyes sparkling with kindness. "Oh, sweetheart, don't you worry about me. I'm just glad you're home safe." Max sat down beside her, trying to shake off the tension from the day. "The police let me go, but they still need to talk to Jake. They think someone might have put something in the car while he borrowed it." Mrs. Davis's face paled a bit. "Is that what they said? What do you think happened?" "I don't know, Grandma, but I promise I'll find out. I won't let anything happen to you," Max assured her, trying to sound confident. Just then, Max's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to check the message. It was a text from Jake. "Hey, Max. I just heard what happened. Is everything okay? I'm really sorry." Max's heart raced. He quickly typed back, "Not really. The police found something in the car. I need to talk to you ASAP." As he sent the message, a strange feeling washed over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Grandma, do you remember anything strange about the day Jake borrowed the car?" he asked, his mind racing. Mrs. Davis thought for a moment, her brows furrowing. "I do remember him mentioning a man at the store, but I didn't think much of it. He seemed friendly enough, just a regular guy." "Do you remember what he looked like?" Max asked, eager for any detail. "Not really," she replied, shaking her head. "But I do recall Jake saying something about the man asking about the car. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think it meant anything." Max felt his stomach drop. "That has to be the man in the black SUV. He must have put something in the car, and now he's watching us." "Max, try to stay calm," Mrs. Davis said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Worrying won't help. Let's focus on what we can do." Max nodded, but anxiety gnawed at him. He felt the weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders. He needed to protect his grandmother and figure out what was really going on. Just as Max was about to speak again, his phone buzzed once more. It was Jake. "Meet me at the park in 30 minutes. We need to talk." Max's heart raced. "Grandma, I need to meet Jake. I'll be back soon." Mrs. Davis looked concerned. "Just be careful, Max. I don't like the sound of all this." "I will, Grandma. I promise." Max hurriedly made his way back to the car, the weight of the day pressing down on him. As he drove toward the park, his mind raced with questions. What did Jake know? Would they be safe? When he arrived at the park, it was eerily quiet. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows on the ground. Max parked and stepped out, scanning the area for Jake. He spotted his cousin sitting on a bench, looking nervous. Max approached him, trying to hide his own anxiety. "Jake, what do you know?" Max asked, urgency in his voice. Jake looked around before speaking. "I overheard something at the store when I borrowed the car. A man was talking to someone, and he mentioned a black SUV and a plan." "What kind of plan?" Max pressed, feeling a chill run down his spine. "I think they're targeting families, Max. They want to cause trouble, and I think they might be coming for us." Max's heart sank. "What do we do? We need to be careful and figure out who that man is. We can't let them hurt anyone." As they sat there, surrounded by the quiet park, Max felt the gravity of their situation. The threat was real, and they had to act quickly. The day's events were only the beginning, and he was determined to uncover the truth before it was too late. As Max and Jake sat on the bench, the weight of their discovery pressed heavily on their minds. They exchanged worried glances, the tension between them thickening. The park was quiet, but the looming danger felt anything but distant. "Jake, we need a plan," Max said, his voice steady despite the fear swirling within him. "We can't just sit here and wait for something to happen. We need to figure out who that man is and what he wants." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "I agree. First, we should gather more information. Let's talk to Grandma. She might remember more about that day at the store." Max's heart sank. What if they come after her? We need to protect her at all costs. "You're right. Let's keep her out of it for now," Jake replied. "But we should still be vigilant. We can't let our guard down." The boys decided to head back to Max's house. As they walked, they discussed their next steps. They would try to find out more about the man in the black SUV and see if anyone in the neighborhood had seen him. When they arrived at the house, Mrs. Davis was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, a comforting reminder of home amid the chaos. "Hey, Grandma," Max called out, forcing a smile. "Everything okay in here?" "Oh, just fine, dear," she replied, her voice cheerful. "Dinner will be ready soon." Max and Jake exchanged a glance, their worry still looming. "Can we talk to you for a minute?" Max asked, leading Jake into the living room where they could speak privately. "Of course. Is something wrong?" Mrs. Davis asked, noticing their serious expressions. Max took a deep breath. "We've been thinking about the man Jake saw at the store. We need to be cautious." Mrs. Davis frowned, her knitting forgotten in her lap. "What man? I thought everything was settled with the police." "It's not that simple, Grandma. We believe he might be involved in something dangerous, and we need to know more about him," Jake explained, urgency creeping into his voice. Mrs. Davis sighed, her expression turning serious. "All right, what do you need me to do?" Max glanced at Jake, then back at his grandmother. "Can you think of anything else about that day? Maybe something that didn't seem important at the time." Mrs. Davis furrowed her brow, deep in thought. "I remember a man asking about the car while I was at the store, but I didn't pay him much mind. He seemed like just another customer." "Did you notice anything unusual about him?" Max pressed, eager for any detail that could help. "Now that you mention it, he did seem a bit too interested in what we were buying," she said slowly. "And I remembered he was wearing a baseball cap. I thought it was strange because it was an unusually warm day." Max and Jake exchanged glances again. A baseball cap. It could be a useful clue. "Thanks, Grandma. We'll keep looking into it," Max said, trying to sound reassuring. Mrs. Davis nodded, her worry evident. "Just promise me you'll be careful. I don't want anything happening to either of you." "We promise," Jake said, patting her hand gently. As they stepped back outside, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Max felt a sense of urgency. They had to act quickly before the situation escalated further. "Let's check around the neighborhood," Max suggested. "We need to see if anyone else noticed anything strange." They began walking down the street, keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity. Their first stop was Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who lived 2 houses down. He was known for his keen eye and love for gossip. "Mr. Thompson," Max called as they approached his porch, where he was sitting in a rocking chair. "Do you have a moment?" "Sure thing, boys. What brings you here?" Mr. Thompson replied, squinting at them over his glasses. "We're trying to find out if you've seen anything unusual lately, like a man in a black SUV or anyone asking about cars." Jake asked, hoping for a lead. Mr. Thompson stroked his chin thoughtfully. Now that you mention it, I did see a man in a black SUV parked around here a couple of days ago. He was just sitting there, watching the street. Did you see what he looked like? Max pressed. He was wearing a baseball cap. Just like you said, Mr. Thompson recalled. He had a beard, too. Looked a bit out of place, if you ask me. Max and Jake exchanged nervous glances again. Do you know where he went? Max asked. Mr. Thompson shook his head. I didn't pay him much mind until now. Just thought he was some odd fellow. Thanks, Mr. Thompson. That helps a lot, Jake said, his mind racing with possibilities. As they continued down the street, Max felt a growing sense of urgency. They were getting closer to the truth, but the threat still loomed over them. Their next stop was Mrs. Green, a neighbor who always seemed to know what was happening in the neighborhood. She was known for her gossip, and often had her ear to the ground. Mrs. Green, Max called as they approached her house. Do you have a minute? Of course, boys. Come in, she said, welcoming them with her usual warmth. Inside, they quickly explained the situation, and Mrs. Green listened intently, her eyes widening with concern. Oh my, I did see a strange man a few days ago. He looked very suspicious, she said. He was parked outside your house for a while. I thought he was just lost. Did you see what he looked like? Jake asked, leaning forward in his seat. Just a glimpse, but yes, he had a baseball cap on and was looking around a lot. He seemed to be watching you, she said, shaking her head. Max's heart raced. Do you think he's connected to what happened with the police? I wouldn't be surprised, dear. You boys need to be very careful, she warned, her tone serious. Thanks, Mrs. Green. We will, Max replied, determination filling his voice. As they left her house, Max felt a mix of anxiety and resolve. They were getting closer to uncovering the truth about the man in the black SUV, but now they needed to figure out what to do next. Max, we should set up a plan. We can't let him catch us off guard, Jake suggested as they walked back toward their house. I agree. We need to keep watch, and if we see anything suspicious, we alert the police right away, Max said, determination in his eyes. As they reached Max's house, they felt a chilling sense of foreboding. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that felt more threatening than ever. They had uncovered some clues, but the danger was still very real. What if he's watching us right now? Jake whispered, his eyes darting around. Then we'll be ready, Max said firmly, knowing that they couldn't let their guard down. They were in this together, and they would protect their family at all costs. The next chapter of their lives was about to unfold, and they had to face whatever came next. Max and Jake spent the night on high alert. They took turns keeping watch, peering out the windows for any sign of danger. The evening stretched on, and the shadows in the house seemed to grow longer and darker. The weight of their discovery hung heavily over them. As the clock struck midnight, Max's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, surprised to see a text from his grandmother. Mrs. Davis, boys, I'm feeling uneasy. I think I saw someone parked outside our house earlier. Please be careful. Max's heart raced. He quickly nudged Jake awake. Jake, Grandma thinks someone is outside. Jake's eyes flew open. What? Right now? Yes, we need to check it out, Max whispered urgently. They quietly crept towards the front window and peeked through the curtains. The street was bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights, casting an eerie light over everything. As their eyes adjusted, they spotted a familiar black SUV parked across the street, engine running, lights off. There it is. That's the SUV, Jake exclaimed, his voice barely above a whisper. Max's stomach tightened. What should we do? Should we call the police? Jake shook his head. No, let's not tip him off. We need to see who it is first. Max nodded, feeling the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. They decided to grab their phones and quietly slip out the back door. As they moved, every creak of the floorboards felt amplified in the stillness of the night. They tiptoed through the yard, staying low to avoid being seen. Max's heart raced with fear and excitement. They reached the edge of the driveway, hiding behind a bush that offered some cover. "Okay, what do we do now?" Jake whispered, glancing at Max. "Let's just wait and see if someone gets out of the car," Max suggested, peering through the leaves. Minutes felt like hours as they watched the SUV, their breath held tight in their throats. Finally, the driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, wearing a baseball cap. "It's him," Jake gasped, eyes wide with shock. They strained to see the man's face as he leaned against the car, looking around. Max and Jake exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do next. The man seemed agitated, checking his phone repeatedly as he stood outside the vehicle. "He looks like he's waiting for someone," Max murmured. "Or watching us," Jake replied, shivering despite the warm night air. Suddenly, the man turned, and Max felt his heart stop. He seemed to be looking directly at them. "Get down," he hissed, pulling Jake down behind the bush. They pressed against the ground, praying they wouldn't be seen. The man stood still for a moment, scanning the area, and Max's heart pounded in his chest. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, the man got back into the SUV. "What is he doing?" Max whispered, panic creeping into his voice. "I don't know, but we can't stick around here," Jake urged, his eyes darting. "Let's go back inside and call the police." Max nodded, and they quietly slipped back towards the house, adrenaline surging through their veins. They reached the back door and slipped inside, closing it gently behind them. Once they were safe inside, Max grabbed his phone and dialed the police. "What should I say?" he asked Jake, anxiety swirling in his gut. "Just tell them there's a suspicious person in a black SUV outside and that you feel unsafe," Jake replied. Max took a deep breath, the weight of the situation heavy on him. "I'll do it." As the phone rang, Max felt a mixture of fear and determination. The operator answered, and he explained the situation as clearly as he could. After a few tense minutes, the operator assured him that they would send someone to investigate. "Just stay inside and keep your doors locked," she said. Once the call ended, Max felt a bit of relief, but knew they still had to stay vigilant. "We should watch from the window," he suggested, leading Jake to the living room. They huddled together near the window, peering out into the darkness, the SUV still parked across the street. Time seemed to stretch as they waited, their hearts pounding in their chests. Suddenly, flashing lights appeared in the distance, illuminating the street. The boys felt a wave of relief wash over them. "It's the police," Jake said, eyes wide with hope. The police car pulled up beside the black SUV, and the officers stepped out, flashlight beams cutting through the night. Max and Jake watched anxiously as the officers approached the SUV, shining their lights inside. "What are they saying?" Max whispered, straining to hear. "Sha, I can't hear anything," Jake replied, eyes glued to the scene outside. The officers began to speak to the man in the SUV, their gestures firm. Max felt a flicker of hope as the situation unfolded. But then, the man suddenly started the engine, and before the officers could react, he sped away down the street. "Wait, come back," Jake yelled, but it was too late. The police officers rushed back to their car, quickly radioing for assistance. Max and Jake exchanged worried glances, knowing that this situation was far from over. "What now?" Max asked, panic rising in his chest. "Let's talk to the officers. Maybe they can tell us more," Jake suggested, his voice steady despite the chaos. As they ran outside, they found the officers discussing the situation near their patrol car. "Excuse me," Max called, his heart racing. "We saw everything." The officers turned, surprise evident on their faces. "What do you know?" one officer asked, his expression serious. Max took a deep breath, ready to share everything he had witnessed. They were determined to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a burning desire to protect their family and uncover the truth. This was only the beginning of their fight against an unseen threat, and they were not about to back down now. The tension in the air was thick as Max and Jake stood before the police officers, hearts pounding. The officers exchanged glances, clearly concerned. "What did you see?" one officer asked, his voice firm but calm. Max stepped forward, his mind racing. "We saw a man in a black SUV. He was parked across the street and looked suspicious. We think he might be connected to the incident with Grandma." The officer nodded, gesturing for them to continue. "And you think he was following you or your grandmother?" "Yes," Jake chimed in. "Grandma said she saw him outside before we called you. He looked like he was watching our house." The officers listened closely, their expressions growing serious. "We'll need to gather more information about this man. If he was indeed following you, we want to find him," one officer said, pulling out a notebook. Max felt a surge of determination. "We can help. We have a video of the SUV from when it was parked outside." "Good thinking," the officer replied, taking Max's phone. "Let's see what you've got." As Max handed over his phone, Jake stepped closer, his eyes wide with worry. "Do you think he'll come back?" The officer paused, considering the question. "It's possible, but we'll increase patrols around your neighborhood for the time being. You boys did the right thing by calling us. Staying vigilant is important." Max felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you. We just want to make sure Grandma is safe." The officer nodded, giving them a reassuring smile. "We'll do everything we can. In the meantime, stay inside and keep your doors locked. We'll keep you updated." After the officers left, Max and Jake took a moment to catch their breath. "What do you think is going on?" Jake asked, glancing toward the window. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of that guy," Max replied, his voice low. They went back to the living room, and Max's thoughts raced. "We should tell Grandma everything," he said finally. Jake nodded. "Let's go find her." They walked down the hallway to Mrs. Davis's room. As they entered, they found her sitting in her favorite chair, knitting peacefully. She looked up with a warm smile, but Max sensed her unease. "Boys, is everything all right?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Max exchanged a glance with Jake, then took a deep breath. "We saw the man in the black SUV again, Grandma. He was parked outside our house, and we think he's been watching you." Mrs. Davis's expression shifted from curiosity to worry. "What? Are you serious?" "Yes," Jake added, stepping closer. "We called the police, and they came to check it out. They're looking for him right now." "Thank you for telling me, boys. I knew something didn't feel right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I appreciate you looking out for me." Max felt a sense of relief wash over him. "We won't let anything happen to you, Grandma. We promise." Just then, a loud noise came from outside, making them all jump. Max rushed to the window and peered outside, his heart racing. The black SUV was back, parked across the street again. "Jake, it's him," Max shouted, panic rising in his chest. Mrs. Davis quickly moved to Max's side, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We need to call the police again," Jake said, pulling out his phone. "This time, we have to get them here fast." Max's hands trembled as he grabbed his phone too, but before they could make the call, the SUV's engine roared to life. They watched, horrified, as the vehicle pulled away, speeding down the street. "Where is he going?" Max wondered aloud, anxiety filling the air. Moments later, a patrol car turned the corner, blue lights flashing. Max and Jake rushed outside to flag down the officers, waving their arms frantically. "Over here," Max yelled, his voice full of urgency. The patrol car skidded to a stop, and the officers jumped out. "What's going on?" one officer asked, looking between Max and Jake. "The man in the black SUV just left. He was right here," Jake explained, pointing down the street. The officers exchanged quick glances, then one officer turned back to them. "Can you describe the vehicle?" "It was black, and it had dark tinted windows. It looked suspicious, and we think he was watching my grandma," Max replied, his heart racing. "All right, we'll send out a description," the officer said, pulling out his radio. As they spoke with the officers, Max noticed movement in the distance. He squinted, trying to see through the fading light. A figure was walking quickly towards them. "Who's that?" he whispered to Jake, feeling a twinge of fear. "I don't know, but it doesn't look good," Jake replied, taking a step closer to Max. The figure drew closer, and Max's heart raced as he realized it was the man from the SUV, his face obscured by shadows. "Stay behind us," one of the officers shouted, stepping forward as they prepared to confront the approaching figure. But before anyone could react, the man turned and sprinted away, disappearing into the darkness. "Stop!" the officer yelled, but the man was already gone. Max felt a mix of fear and frustration. "He got away," he exclaimed, feeling helpless. "Don't worry," one of the officers reassured him. "We'll increase patrols and make sure your grandmother is safe. You did everything right by reporting it." As the officers continued their search, Max and Jake returned inside, adrenaline still pumping. They knew the threat was still out there, but they were determined to protect their family. As they sat together with Mrs. Davis, Max looked at his grandmother, his heart full of love. "We'll always keep you safe, Grandma, no matter what happens." Mrs. Davis smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I know you will, my brave boys. I'm so proud of you both." In that moment, they felt a bond stronger than fear. Together, they would face whatever came next, united as a family, ready to confront any danger that lurked in the shadows. The night might be filled with uncertainty, but their hearts were strong, and they knew they would face whatever came their way together. The danger had not passed, but they were ready to stand together, ready to fight for their family.